Lena sat in the dimly lit living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. The house was quiet, almost unnervingly so. Her children were at school, and Mark had left early for work, as usual. She had a rare moment of solitude to think, to reflect on everything that had happened in the past few months. The weight of it all felt suffocating, but she had no choice but to press forward. For years, Lena had been the quiet force behind the scenes, keeping her family together through financial struggles, emotional challenges, and the ever-growing demands of everyday life. It wasn't glamorous, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was her role. She had accepted it, perhaps even embraced it, though at times it seemed like the world had placed an unfair burden on her shoulders. Her in-laws had never been financially stable. Lena knew that when she married Mark, and she had done her best to help them as best as she could, often at the expense of her own financial stability. It had started innocently enough, small loans to cover unexpected bills, helping with groceries when they were short, and offering her support during their various health issues. Over time, though, the requests became more frequent and more demanding. It seemed like there was always something, another hospital bill, a car repair, or an emergency that required more money. Mark, although a decent man at heart, was often distant when it came to these matters. His parents were a constant source of stress for him too, but he didn't always know how to handle it, and so he leaned on Lena to be the solution. She had always felt like she couldn't say no. It wasn't just about money, it was about keeping the peace. She hated conflict, and more than anything, she didn't want to disappoint her in-laws or make them feel ashamed of their financial situation. Her own parents had always been frugal but self-sufficient, and she had grown up with the understanding that hard work and careful planning could solve most problems. But when it came to her in-laws, no matter how much Lena helped, it never seemed to be enough. And so, when their debts reached a critical point, Lena knew what she had to do. The tipping point had come when her father-in-law's medical condition worsened, and they needed a large sum of money to cover the costs of an expensive treatment. They couldn't get a loan from the bank, and despite her mother-in-law's best efforts to sell some things, they were still short. Lena had quietly taken out a loan in her name, pulling from every possible resource she could find. She dipped into her savings, borrowed from her credit cards, and even took a second mortgage on their home. Anything to keep the creditors at bay and ensure her in-laws' well-being. She had hoped that this would be the end of it, that after this, the pressure would ease and everyone could finally move on with their lives. But it wasn't. The months following her decision were some of the most exhausting and emotionally draining of her life. Not only did she feel the weight of her own financial stress, but the tension between Mark and his parents seemed to grow. Mark had never been one to take on the burden of family finances, and now that Lena had cleared the debt, he felt more distant than ever. Lena hadn't realized just how deep the chasm had grown until she found herself dealing with his parents more often than he was. She'd handle the phone calls, the requests for help, and the constant worry that seemed to hang over them like a dark cloud. Mark had taken to working longer hours, leaving Lena alone to handle everything, as if he was avoiding the situation entirely. She couldn't blame him. She understood the tension he felt, but there were times when she just needed him to step in and take charge. That evening, as Lena flipped through the pile of receipts and papers that represented months of sacrifice, her phone buzzed on the table beside her. It was a message from Mark. "Hey, can you please meet me at home after work? I need to talk." Lena's heart skipped a beat. Something about the tone of his message felt different. It wasn't the casual, everyday text she was used to. There was a heaviness to it, a sense of urgency. She sat still for a moment, staring at the words, unsure of what to think. The last few weeks had been tense, yes, but nothing had prepared her for what was coming. She felt a sudden knot in her stomach, but quickly pushed the feeling aside. Maybe it was just the stress of everything catching up to him. Maybe he had just been feeling overwhelmed and needed to talk. Lena, ever the optimist, tried to convince herself that it wasn't anything to worry about. She sent a quick reply. "Of course, I'll be there." When Mark walked through the door later that evening, Lena was already sitting on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She could see the tension in his face, the way his shoulders were hunched, and she immediately knew that whatever he had to say wasn't going to be easy to hear. He closed the door behind him softly, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. Lena couldn't bring herself to ask what was going on, and Mark seemed to be struggling with his own words. Finally, he sat down beside her, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Lena," he began, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. "I need to tell you something." Lena nodded, trying to steady her breath. She could feel her heart rate quicken, her pulse pounding in her ears. The moment felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't wake up from. She braced herself, trying to prepare for whatever was coming. I've been seeing someone else," Mark continued, his voice cracking. "For the last year." The words hit Lena like a punch to the stomach. For a moment, she couldn't even breathe. Her mind raced, trying to process what he had just said, but the shock was too overwhelming. She had suspected that something had been off between them for a while now. Mark had been distant, distracted, but she never imagined this. The betrayal felt like a sharp knife twisting in her chest. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you talking about? You've been seeing someone else?" He nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "Her name is Sarah. She's a colleague at work. It started as just talking, but over time it became more. I'm in love with her, Lena." His voice was shaky, as if the words themselves were hard to admit. Lena could hardly comprehend what she was hearing. The man she had loved, the man she had supported through thick and thin, had been leading a double life. While she had been struggling with the weight of their finances, with the mounting pressure of keeping everything together, he had found comfort in someone else's arms. Her heart shattered as the reality of his words sank in. "I'm sorry," he added, his voice almost pleading now. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to tell you. But I need to be with her now, Lena. I need to figure out how to move forward with Sarah." Lena felt as though the floor had been pulled out from under her. She had spent so long trying to keep their life together, trying to fix everything for everyone, and now this. Mark, the man she had married, the father of her children, was telling her that he wanted to leave her for another woman? For a long time, neither of them spoke. Lena tried to hold back the tears, but they came anyway. She had worked so hard for their family, had given everything she had, both financially and emotionally, and this was the price she paid. "Finally," she whispered, barely able to speak through the lump in her throat. "So, what happens now, Mark? You want to live with her? After everything we've been through?" Mark looked at her with pain in his eyes. "I don't know what else to do, Lena. I never meant for this to happen, but I can't keep living a lie. I need to be with her." Lena felt a coldness wash over her. She wasn't sure if it was the anger or the heartbreak, but it didn't matter. She knew in that moment that she couldn't continue in a relationship where she was no longer respected, no longer valued. The debt, the sacrifices, the years of giving her all, it didn't matter to him. And now, it seemed like nothing mattered to her either. "Go, then," Lena said quietly, her voice firm despite the tears in her eyes. "Go to her, but know that I'm done." Mark sat there, motionless, as if waiting for her to say something more, but Lena didn't have the strength. There was nothing left to say. He had made his choice, and so had she. As he left the room, Lena felt the weight of everything crash down on her. The debt, the lies, the years of giving without receiving. She was done. It was time to figure out how to rebuild her life. Piece by painful piece. The evening that Mark dropped his bombshell on her was a blur. Lena didn't know how to react at first. Part of her felt numb, detached from her own emotions, while another part screamed for him to take it all back, to say it was a mistake, that he hadn't meant it. But as Mark's words lingered in the air, there was no denying the truth of what he had said. He had been seeing someone else for the past year. He was in love with her. And he was asking Lena, the woman he had promised to love and cherish, to accept the reality that he was leaving her for someone else. Lena's mind raced. She had no idea how to process what was unfolding in front of her. She had spent so much of her life focusing on the needs of others, her children, her husband, her in-laws. But in this moment, She realized that she had neglected one thing: herself. How had she missed the signs? How had she not seen the cracks forming in her marriage? Was it all her fault? Could she have done something differently? These thoughts overwhelmed her, and she had to blink back the tears that threatened to spill. Mark, sitting on the couch beside her, seemed uncomfortable in the silence. He didn't know what to say anymore. The apology he had offered was half-hearted, as though it wasn't enough to undo the damage he had caused. Lena didn't even know if it was the apology she needed to hear. He was sorry, sure, but sorry for what? For the affair? For hurting her? Or was he sorry because the consequences of his actions had finally caught up with him? She found herself staring at him, feeling a deep sense of disconnection. The man she had married, the man she had stood by through thick and thin, was a stranger in this moment. She didn't recognize him anymore. She had always known that marriage wasn't always easy, that there would be challenges, but she had never imagined that the person she had devoted so much of her life to could betray her in such a way. "I don't know what you want from me, Mark," Lena finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She didn't know where the words had come from, but she knew they were true. "You've told me that you've been seeing someone else. You've told me you're in love with her. What do you want me to do? What am I supposed to do with that?" Mark opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to fail him. He was visibly uncomfortable, shifting on the couch as though the very space between them had become unbearable. "I don't want to hurt you, Lena. I never meant for any of this to happen. It just did. It started so innocently. Just some conversations at work. She's kind, understanding. She listened to me when I needed someone, and over time, it became more. I didn't plan it. I didn't mean for this to happen." Lena was staring at him now, her heart pounding in her chest. "You didn't mean for it to happen?" she asked, her voice shaking. "So it just happened? You didn't think about me, about what this would do to our family, to our kids?" Mark looked down, his eyes avoiding hers. "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't think I would fall in love with her." The room felt suffocating. Lena's thoughts were spinning out of control. She had poured everything into their relationship, everything into their family. She had sacrificed so much to make sure they were taken care of. She had taken on the burden of their debts, the emotional weight of their lives, always trying to fix things, always trying to be the one who made everything work. And now here she was, facing the cold reality that the person she trusted most in the world was the one who had betrayed her. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. She wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer, but she had to ask. "About a year," Mark replied, his voice filled with regret. "It wasn't just physical. It wasn't just about sex. It was more than that. I started confiding in her, sharing things with her I hadn't shared with you. She understood me, Lena. I felt heard for the first time in a long time." Lena's chest tightened as she processed his words. This wasn't just about an affair in the traditional sense. It wasn't just about cheating. It was about a deep emotional betrayal. About the fact that Mark had turned to someone else for everything that Lena had been trying to provide. The emotional connection, the support. She had been so focused on her responsibilities, so immersed in the weight of her obligations that she had failed to realize that Mark had felt abandoned. And now, here they were, facing the wreckage of their relationship. "Why didn't you tell me?" Lena asked, the tears finally breaking free. "Why didn't you talk to me, Mark? We could have worked through it. We've been through so much together. You couldn't have come to me? Instead, you let it go on for a year? You let me sacrifice everything, and for what? So you could have her?" Mark looked pained, but he said nothing. There was nothing he could say that would undo what had been done. Lena wasn't sure whether he was regretting the affair itself or regretting that he was caught. "I didn't want to hurt you," he said again, his voice quieter this time. "I thought I could fix it on my own. I didn't want to drag you into it." Lena shook her head. "You've already dragged me into it, Mark. You've already ruined everything. I didn't deserve this. After everything I've done, after everything I've given, this is how you repay me?" He opened his mouth, but Lena cut him off. "No, don't try to apologize now. Don't make it sound like you just made a mistake. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice, Mark. This was a year of lying, of betrayal, of choosing someone else over your wife." The anger that had been simmering inside her finally erupted. She stood up, pacing around the room, feeling like she might explode if she didn't do something. "I've been here, Mark. I've been here all along, doing everything I could to make sure our family was okay. I paid off the debts, I took care of your parents, I made sure the kids had everything they needed, and this is what I get? I get you in love with someone else?" She paused, taking a breath, trying to steady herself. "I can't even look at you right now. I don't even know who you are anymore. You're not the man I married. The man I married would never have done this." Mark sat there silently, watching her, his face a mixture of guilt and helplessness. But his silence only made the pain worse. Lena wanted him to beg for forgiveness, to show her that he understood the gravity of what he had done, but he didn't. He just sat there, his eyes hollow, his shoulders slumped, as though the weight of his actions was finally pressing down on him. Lena looked at him one last time and then turned away. She couldn't bear to be in the same room with him any longer. Every fiber of her being screamed for him to leave, to go to Sarah, to be with the person he had chosen. She didn't want him anymore. The man she had once loved had betrayed her in the worst possible way. "I need you to leave, Mark," Lena said quietly, her voice firm but raw with emotion. "I can't do this. I need space. I need to think." Mark opened his mouth to say something, but the words caught in his throat. He didn't know what to say anymore. There was nothing left to say. The damage had been done. "I'll stay at a friend's place for tonight," he muttered, standing up slowly. I'm sorry, Lena. I never wanted to hurt you." But Lena didn't respond. She simply watched him as he walked out the door, the sound of it closing behind him echoing through the empty house. She was alone now. She didn't know what to do next. All she knew was that she had to face the consequences of his choices, and somehow, she had to find a way to move on. As the silence in the house stretched on, Lena sat down on the couch, burying her face in her hands. Her heart ached, not just from the betrayal, but from the realization that everything she had worked so hard for, the marriage, the family, had come crumbling down. She didn't know where to go from here. But one thing was certain. She couldn't keep living in the shadow of Mark's betrayal. She would have to rebuild. She would have to find herself again. And no matter how hard it seemed, she knew she couldn't let him back in. The house felt unbearably quiet after Mark left. Lena sat on the couch for a long time, staring at the space where he had just been. The silence in the room was oppressive, like the weight of everything that had happened was pressing down on her chest. She didn't know how long she sat there, just staring. But when she finally looked up, it was already dark outside. Her eyes were sore from the tears she had shed, but even the physical pain didn't feel like enough to release the storm of emotions that churned inside her. She had spent so many years trying to be everything for everyone: wife, mother, daughter-in-law, caretaker, and now it felt like all of it had been for nothing. Mark was gone, and the life they had built together felt like a lie. How could he have done this? How could he have betrayed her so completely after everything she had done for him? She had thought their marriage was solid, their love unshakable. But now, the foundation had crumbled, and she was left holding the pieces of a life that no longer made sense. Lena's first instinct was to call someone, to talk to a friend, to reach out to her family for support. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. She felt ashamed of what Mark had done, but also ashamed of herself. How had she not seen the signs? How had she not known something was wrong? Was she that blind to the cracks in their marriage? Was she so focused on taking care of everything and everyone else that she had forgotten to pay attention to the one person who was supposed to be her partner? The guilt washed over her in waves. If only she had been more attentive, if only she had asked him the right questions, if only she had been more present in their relationship, maybe this wouldn't have happened. But the truth was, Lena didn't know what had gone wrong. She had done everything she could to keep things together. She had worked herself to the bone, sacrificed her own happiness and well-being to make sure Mark and the kids were taken care of. What more could she have done? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening. Startled, Lena quickly wiped her eyes, trying to pull herself together before her children came in. They had no idea what had happened. How could she explain this to them? How could she explain to her son and daughter that their father had fallen in love with someone else and was leaving them? She couldn't bear the thought of them knowing. It felt like a betrayal to them, too. "Mom, we're home," her son Lucas called out as he and his sister Emma entered the living room. Lena quickly forced a smile, standing up to greet them. "Hey, sweethearts," she said, her voice unsteady. "How was your day?" "It was good," Emma replied, dropping her backpack on the floor. "But we have a math test tomorrow, so I'm kind of stressed." Lucas, always more observant than his sister, noticed her expression immediately. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, frowning slightly. Lena's heart ached at the concern in his voice. She didn't want to burden them with her problems. They were just kids. They didn't need to know about the mess she was dealing with. "I'm fine, sweetheart." "Just a little tired, that's all," she said, forcing her voice to sound calm. "But don't worry, I'm sure you'll both do great on your test tomorrow." Emma nodded, though she still looked a little suspicious. "Okay if you say so." Lena kissed them both on the forehead and told them to get ready for dinner, all the while trying to hide the pain she was feeling. She couldn't let them see the cracks forming in her world. Not yet. Not until she had figured out how to put it all back together. She needed to protect them from the chaos that was swirling in her heart. As the evening passed, Lena went through the motions of being a mother, helping with homework, making dinner, tucking the kids into bed. But her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about Mark, about the life they had built, and about how everything had come crashing down. She had always thought that no matter what happened, they would be okay, but now she realized how fragile that assumption had been. How could she have been so naive? Once the kids were asleep, Lena found herself standing in the kitchen, staring at the pile of dishes in the sink. She didn't have the energy to do them. She didn't have the energy to do anything. But she forced herself to pick up a dish, then another, until the pile was cleared away. She needed to do something, anything, to distract herself from the storm of emotions inside her. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and for a brief moment she wondered if it was Mark. Maybe he was reaching out, trying to explain himself, trying to make it right. But when she looked at the screen, she saw it wasn't him. It was a message from her best friend, Clara. "I'm here if you need to talk. Please don't keep this to yourself." Lena stared at the message for a moment, her finger hovering over the keyboard as she considered replying. She wanted to reach out, to tell Clara everything that had happened, but she felt too ashamed, too vulnerable. What could she say? What would Clara think of her, of Mark? She didn't want to be judged, but more than that, she didn't want to face the reality of what had happened. She wasn't ready to talk yet. But after a few moments, she took a deep breath and typed back, "Thanks. I'm not sure I'm ready yet." She put her phone down and walked to the living room, sitting on the couch with her head in her hands. She had always been the strong one, the one who held it all together, the one people turned to when they needed help. But now, in the wake of Mark's betrayal, she didn't know who she was anymore. She was lost. She felt like she had been living in a fog for so long, just going through the motions, trying to keep the peace, trying to make everything work. But now, everything felt like it had been a lie. The next few days passed in a blur. Mark didn't call, he didn't text. It was as though he had already moved on, as though he was already building a life with Sarah. Lena was left to pick up the pieces of her shattered heart and try to figure out how to move forward. She couldn't stop thinking about him, about the life they had shared, about the dreams they had built together. But every time she thought about it, a wave of anger would crash over her. How could he have done this? How could he have thrown it all away so easily? Didn't he care about their family? Didn't he care about her? But then she would remember something else. The way he had confessed to her. The guilt in his eyes. The way he had tried to explain himself. It wasn't that he didn't care about her. It was that he had made a choice. A choice to be with someone else. A choice to leave her, to abandon their family. And that was something she couldn't forgive. The pain was sharp, like a constant ache that wouldn't go away. But as the days turned into weeks, Lena started to feel something else, something unexpected. Strength. She had always relied on Mark, always leaned on him for support, but now she realized that she didn't need him. She didn't need anyone to validate her, to tell her that she was enough. She was enough. And as much as it hurt, as much as she hated him for what he had done, she knew she had to move on. For herself, for her children, for her future. The first step was the hardest. She had to call a lawyer. She needed to know her options, to make sure she was prepared for what was coming. She didn't want to, but she knew it was necessary. The second step was telling the kids. She had to explain what had happened, and though the thought of it terrified her, she knew it was something they needed to hear from her. They deserved the truth, even if it was painful. But through it all, one thing became clear. Lena wasn't going to let this destroy her. She wasn't going to let Mark's choices define her. She was stronger than that. She would find a way to heal, to move on, and to rebuild her life. And though it seemed impossible in the moment, Lena knew that someday she would look back on this time and realize that it was the beginning of something new, something better. Lena had spent weeks navigating the choppy waters of heartache, loneliness, and uncertainty. Each day felt like a small step forward, but the weight of Mark's betrayal still pressed down on her, even as she tried to rebuild her life. The first few weeks without him had been the hardest. There were moments when the silence felt unbearable, when the absence of his presence in the house left a gaping hole in her heart. She had spent so many years investing in their marriage, and now it felt as though all of that time had been wasted. But there were also moments of clarity. Moments when she realized that despite the pain, she had the strength to move on. She was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. She had to be. Her children depended on her, and that responsibility was the one thing that kept her going when the darkness threatened to overwhelm her. One of the first things Lena had done was contact a lawyer. She needed to understand her legal rights, especially when it came to their finances and custody of the kids. She didn't want to make any rash decisions, but she knew she couldn't stay in limbo forever. She had to face the reality of what had happened and figure out how to protect herself and her children. The lawyer was kind, understanding, but also practical. She explained the process of divorce and what it would mean for Lena's future. The financial situation was complicated. Mark had already taken steps to move his assets and cut ties with their joint accounts. But Lena had taken care of most of the household bills and had a decent credit score. She would be able to keep the house, but the financial strain would be difficult to manage on her own. The lawyer advised her to start budgeting more carefully and to look into ways of securing her financial independence. "Don't worry about the future too much," the lawyer said gently. "Focus on the immediate steps and the rest will fall into place. You'll find a way." Those words stayed with Lena as she walked out of the office. It felt like a small victory. At least now she had a plan, even if it was just the beginning. She was no longer just reacting to the situation. She was taking control. The next hurdle was telling the kids. She had been avoiding it for weeks, unsure of how to break the news that their father was never coming back. She knew they had noticed his absence, and they had asked her questions she didn't know how to answer. "Why doesn't Dad come home anymore, Mom?" Lucas had asked one night as they were having dinner. Emma had been quieter, but Lena could see the confusion and sadness in her eyes. Lena had been tempted to lie, to tell them that their father was away on business or that there had been some misunderstanding, but deep down she knew they deserved the truth. They were smart, perceptive, and they would figure it out on their own eventually. It would be better to explain it in her own words than have them hear it from someone else. One Sunday afternoon, when the kids were playing in the backyard, Lena sat down on the couch and took a deep breath. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, but she knew it was time. "Come here, you two," she called, trying to sound calm, though her voice trembled. "We need to talk." Emma and Lucas looked at each other, their faces full of concern. They had seen their mother's mood shift in the past few weeks, and they could tell something was off. "Is everything okay, Mom?" Lucas asked. Lena nodded, her throat tight. "I'm okay," she said, trying to smile. "But there's something I need to tell you both. It's about your dad." Emma frowned, sitting down next to her mother. "Where's Dad, Mom? Why hasn't he been here?" Lena took a deep breath and braced herself for the conversation that would change everything. "Your dad and we're not together anymore. He's not coming back. He's with someone else." There was a long pause. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't say anything. Lucas, on the other hand, looked confused, almost angry. "What do you mean? Why isn't he coming back?" he demanded. Lena gently took his hand. "Sometimes grown-ups make choices that hurt other people," she said softly. "Your dad made a choice to be with someone else, and because of that, he's not coming home. But I want you both to know that it's not your fault. This has nothing to do with either of you. Your dad and I couldn't make it work, but I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere." Lucas looked at her, his eyes wide with confusion. "But why would he do that? Doesn't he love us?" Lena's heart ached. "He loves you both, Lucas, but sometimes people make mistakes, and sometimes they don't make the right choices." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and Lucas looked down at the floor. Lena's heart shattered, but she held her ground. She couldn't afford to crumble now. She had to be strong. For them. "I know this is hard," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "and it's going to take time to adjust, but we'll get through this together. We'll be okay." It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was the only one Lena could give. And as she watched her children process the news in their own ways, Emma clinging to her for comfort, Lucas retreating into his room to be alone, Lena realized just how much she had to carry. She had always thought that she was strong, that she could handle anything life threw at her. But now, she realized that her strength wasn't just about managing the practical things. It was about showing up every day for herself and for her children. It was about learning to rebuild a life that had been shattered, and about doing it with grace, even when it felt impossible. As the weeks passed, Lena continued to take small steps forward. She focused on her work, spending long hours at the office and making sure the kids were settled into a new routine. There were still moments when she wanted to break down, when the loneliness felt overwhelming, or when she missed the way things used to be. But she didn't let herself stay there for long. She had learned the hard way that dwelling in the past only made things worse. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could change how she responded to it. One evening, after a particularly challenging day at work, Lena sat down on the couch with a cup of tea, exhausted but determined. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen to see a text message from Clara. "How are you doing? I've been thinking about you. Let's get together soon." Lena smiled faintly, feeling a sense of warmth from her friend's words. She hadn't talked to Clara much in the past few weeks, mostly because she hadn't been ready. But now, the idea of reconnecting felt good. She needed to rebuild her support system, and Clara had always been there for her. "I'd like that. Let's set something up." As she sent the message, Lena realized that she had begun to feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't a grand, sweeping emotion, but a quiet, steady feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. She had been through the worst of it. The pain, the anger, the betrayal, they were all still there, but they no longer defined her. She was learning to trust herself again, to believe in her ability to create a life that was hers, independent of Mark and everything he had taken from her. She was learning to love herself again, and that, she realized, was the most important thing of all. Months later, Lena stood in front of her bathroom mirror, running a brush through her hair. She had done the work, the emotional work, the practical work, and though it hadn't been easy, she was proud of how far she had come. The pain still lingered, but it was no longer an all-consuming force. She was no longer just surviving. She was living again. Her children had adjusted. They were still processing the changes, but they had each other, and they had Lena, and that was enough. They had a new normal now, one where they could lean on each other without fear of what tomorrow might bring. Lena's phone buzzed again, this time with a reminder for an upcoming meeting at work. She had started taking on new projects, pushing herself to grow professionally, and she felt a sense of pride in the work she was doing. She wasn't the same person she had been before the affair. She was different, stronger, more resilient, and more aware of her own worth. As she picked up her phone and walked out of the bathroom, Lena looked out the window, feeling a quiet sense of peace settle over her. She had made it through the storm, and now she was ready for whatever came next. In that moment, Lena knew that she was no longer defined by the past. She was forging her own path, one that was hers to create. and as difficult as it had been, she had emerged from the darkness with a newfound sense of self. She was ready to embrace the future, no matter what it held.